Okay, American Folk Art Questions and Quandaries. This is the second of two articles, essays, book reviews, this week and last. As a bit of background, John Michael Vlatch, the author of American Folk Art Questions and Quandaries, is an anthropology professor and the director of a university folk life program. So his approach as an anthropologist, as someone interested in, as anthropology implies, the study of man and our habits and that sort of thing, is different than that of an art historian. Art historians often just look at visuals, they look at forms, and they look at the way that that ties into culture. His approach, coming from anthropology, is somewhat different. And this is a criticism of a book by Lynette Rhodes, American Folk Art from the Traditional to the Naive, which I'm not expecting you to read. It is in part a criticism of her acceptance of assumptions from the past. So it's kind of an update uh, in saying this book draws from this body of assumptions. We think some of those assumptions maybe should be challenged and changed. And these are some of the main themes. There is a theme of communal versus individual in a lot of folk art. Folk art is oftentimes an art of the everyday, something made for a purpose and something acceptable to a group, which we've seen a lot of. So you might have a basket that is made in a traditional form, or a piece of pottery that is meant to contain or hold something. That is very, very functional and kind of the essence of folk art. The same with wood carving for a cane for a particular member of the community, and that would convey status, that sort of thing, or quilting, right? A perfect example of the art of the everyday made for a purpose. Because it is something that is passed down in a traditional sense from one generation to the next, you carry that culture with you when you pass it down. Now, of course, you innovate at some point. Many artists do. You change it up and you make it your own after you've thoroughly absorbed the expectations, and usually not before you've absorbed those expectations. So the question is, are the people who innovate within the tradition of quilting or pottery in a particular culture or basket making, are they traditional folk artists, or are they stepping outside of that tradition? That is kind of an open question. And there's the great example of Simon Rodia's Watchtowers. I will link a video to Watchtowers for you to be able to watch if you're unfamiliar with it. It's classified as folk art, but it's really the work of one person, and there is no precedent for it within a folk art tradition. You can look back at Italian architecture to see some of the places where Simon Rodia got his ideas most likely, but he's really kind of his own guy. So is he a folk artist? Not in that very traditional sense of being part of a community and passing that on. There is also simple versus complex. So ethnocentrism, which is the idea that our particular culture is the best one and superior, and everybody else is not quite as good. And that's an idea, to be clear, that a lot of cultures have or have had at one point, right? I mean, everybody's always the best, and their neighbors are always not quite as good as them, right? So that oftentimes gives a distinction in folk art from the academic, the official art, versus the untrained art that could be thought of as naive, non academic, sometimes anonymous. And there's a bias towards the Western canon. And by the Western canon, if you don't know, I mean the stuff that's in all the art history books, right? The stuff that's been taught for a long time, the stuff that is expected. So if we say that folk artists are anonymous, and sometimes you get that with, who made this quilt, unless you happen to know that maker's name, you just see it listed as a quilt, right? The same thing with a ceramic vessel or with a basket. We don't put a name to that like we would Michelangelo or Leonardo or Picasso, right? Which is what we would often do with art. Real, true folk art has its own training, and the word craft, art, and skill all tie together into the same term if you take it back to the Latin. But if you are within that community of makers, then you know what you're talking about, and you can recognize the work of one craftsman or tradesman or artisan as much as you could the work of a particular painter. So Lanier Metters, the North Georgia potter that we looked at a few weeks ago, he can look at a vessel and know if it's made by his father or his uncle, or of course by him, just based on the way that it looks, right? The more you delve into it, the more familiar you are, the more you understand the trademarks of the particular artist. In the same way that the more you get into art history, you can look at a painting and say, oh, that's a Titian, or that's a Rembrandt, or a Caravaggio, or a Gentileschi. If you are totally new to the field of art history, or in the case of these examples of painting, from the Italian Baroque or late Renaissance, you've got no idea, right? It looks like an old painting. But if you're an art historian in that field, immediately you know what the difference is. And as an example, this is entitled The Gritty Realism of Genre American artist David Gilmore Blythe. This is a wood carving of a particular person, and this is classified oftentimes as folk art because it has a rough, raw directness to it. I mean, it looks good enough. It looks like it's skilled. Compare it to this sculpture of a person from a similar time by an academic artist. And this looks like it came from ancient Greece or Rome because of the robe, because of the finely chiseled marble, and because of the style that on purpose imitates Roman art in this case, right? This guy looks like he is a Caesar or a Roman senator. So this is a portrait in the official art style that people loved at the time. This is a portrait in the unofficial art style of the people, and you can see the difference, right? One is thought to be much more sophisticated and stately and all of that. And of course, marble is a material that has kind of a higher price tag than a piece of wood. And then this is much more direct, much more simple, much more raw, if you want to put it in those terms. So that's the kind of distinction that is there. Now, in real life, both of these are fine. They're both portraits of individuals. They're just different styles with different expectations from the artist. And that has much more to do with a cultural bias than it does with the sophistication of the artist themselves. It's more of kind of a judgment value based on the taste of the critic rather than what the artist wanted to do or could not do. And along those same lines, there is an assumption about instinct versus intention. There is oftentimes the assumption that folk artists are instinctual in the way that they work, that they don't plan it out. The same goes into folk music, blues, jazz, fiddle tunes from Appalachia. There is an idea that they do what they can do and they can't do anything else, which may or may not be the case, of course. Early jazz musicians, who were almost without exception African American, and a handful of exceptions, right? Early jazz musicians often played in front of white audiences without sheet music. So the idea would be maintained for the audience's sake that this was a sort of primal, intuitive music that went along with their perception of the African Americans playing that music. Now, in real life, jazz is incredibly sophisticated. It is America's classical music form. All those early guys were playing in three-piece suits and had amazing musical knowledge. I mean, look at John Coltrane's Giant Steps, in which every section is in a different key. Look at Miles Davis, who revolutionized jazz music about 5 times, with everyone else following in his wake. The tall figures of jazz are truly geniuses. There was, though, from a white American audience, the assumption that that was not on par with classical European music, for example. So, instinct versus intention is much more of a cultural assumption, again, kind of based on the part of the critic, whether that's an art critic or the audience at the club, then it is something that actually holds up when you look at it more closely. And naivety versus competence, very, very similar to instinct versus intention. The example is given for early New England gravestone carving. They go from the images carved on gravestones, go from winged skulls eventually to babies, to portraits of people that are more lifelike than just a cherub, a winged baby, eventually to urns and willows. And that, if you study it, has more to do with the taste of the people at the time and those changing tastes than it does with the skill of the craftsman. It's not like the craftsman got better over time and that's why they changed the style. It's that what the clients wanted changed over time. And as a stone carver, making a very functional grave marker, you want to give the client what they want because they're very particular about the way they want their loved ones to be remembered. So the early ones, such as these, and this is just from a Google search, there is a skull with wings oftentimes. These are very primitively done. Eventually they have faces instead of skulls. They have a little more detail. This is a fairly simple face with wings here. And a lot of these look like they could be from the Middle Ages, especially the older ones, because the style is seemingly unsophisticated and direct. Although the stone carver would be able to sculpt something much more ornate, detailed, subtle, and nuanced. If that is what the client wanted, they'd certainly figure out how to do that. So the changes that we see were listed in kind of the original book that's being reviewed as kind of changes in skill that go along, but it's really a change in public taste, and the carver was very, very skilled. It's that the client expectations progressed through culture. And the forms of folk art. Utilitarian art means that you use it for something. Is it art? Is it craft? Look at how it's used, what it's used for, how that purpose relates to the community, how that purpose relates to social ties. Duck decoys, oftentimes hand-carved and can be very expensive. The more naturalistic ones are really done for the craftsman to show their skill than how well they fool the duck, because we've known for a long time it doesn't have to look just like a real duck for the duck to come light next to it on the pond. But the really, really skillfully carved ones might be displayed in your house more so than put in the pond to use. So there is a level of utility that's there, and the very reason for the object being there. How much does that cross over into the realm of just showing the skill of the craftsman? I mean, it just depends, like everything else. So it can be utilitarian with a lot of beauty added onto it as well. And then there's visionary art, which is art that literally, oftentimes, sometimes figuratively, is influenced by a vision. So William Blake, well-known poet and artist, certainly in a lot of literature classes, was a visionary artist, right? He saw visions in a visual sort of sense, presences, and his artwork was guided through that. So he is spiritually inspired. If the vision is a collective one and not an individual one, you could call that folk art. If the vision is one that is only given to the individual artist, not so much folk art, because it's not a collective experience. Howard Finster's Paradise Garden in Somerville is a great example of a visionary art environment. He had visions, they were the driving factor behind the artwork that he made, but those visions were his alone. So loosely speaking, people call Howard Finster a folk artist all the time. I usually don't correct them, but technically speaking, he's a visionary artist if you really want to kind of get down to those definitions. And those differences are there. Santos figures are folk art. These are figures from Mexican tradition, and they're saints, right? So they're carved in different ways. depending on who's doing the carving. They can be simple, they can be ornate. There are a lot of people that make these. So these sort of carved figures, little saints, little icons, are very much part of a tradition. They might be influenced by religious vision. They might help bring a religious vision about for someone else. But they can only be labeled folk art because they are a collective. Edgar Tolson's work, and Edgar Tolson is a different sort of carver. He carves religious themes as well, but these are scenes of Adam and Eve typically, and they don't really come from that same tradition that the Santos figures come from, right? This is his own thing. So here you have Adam, Eve, a tree with fruit, a winged angel, and a snake in the middle. Because there's not really a similar precedence for his work with a lot of other people, he's not really considered the folk artist. He's more of a visionary or just of his own, an artist of his own making. So hopefully that difference is fairly clear. The Santos figures are carved by a lot of people, even though artists have their own style. Edward Tolson's work is much more individual. And Edward Hicks' Peaceable Kingdom, when I pulled this up, you may or may not have seen it before. It's a very well-known image. It's claimed as folk art because of his lack of formal art training and kind of the clunkiness of his images. He also has a background in painting furniture, painting signs, back when signs were hand-painted for stores and advertising. He was not someone who considered his artwork to be fantastic or even great. He thought painting was, and this is in quotes, one of those trifling, insignificant arts compared to people who actually did something functional to help mankind. So he is borrowing from trained art eventually and kind of moving into a gray area as far as categorization. And all of this kind of begs the question, how much does categorization matter? I mean, it's an academic question. That's what this class is about. But if you enjoy it, you get something from it. This is Edward Hicks' Peaceable Kingdom. He has a lot of versions of this. I bought a house at one point, and there was one of these in the closet. It was an incredibly popular print. And you can see essentially Garden of Eden with all the animals, with some people, and then over here you have natives and settlers getting along, peaceful treaties, peaceful kingdom, lions and babies, all of that. So because of the kind of naive, self-taught, untaught nature of his painting style, he's often considered a folk artist. He's really an individual, but he is a naive painter, technically. But he's considered to be folk art as well, generally speaking. And the fact that it is a religious image kind of brings it into the category of visionary art or spiritually inspired works as well. And then, kind of lastly, in the 20th and moving into the 21st century, where we are today, American folk art doesn't exist at the national level, is actually what it should say, but at regional, local, and family levels. It's a much smaller scale thing than a folk art for all of America. Now, if you look at German folk art, for example, there are enough similarities that you could hone in on the Germanness, or the same thing for folk art from other nations around Europe. Scandinavian folk art is going to have its own particular style, that sort of thing. If you look at individual cultures within Africa, then you'll certainly find some similarities, but within a nation, and a lot of those boundaries have been kind of randomly drawn, you're going to find multiple cultures, and of course within the entire continent of Africa, you're going to find a lot of different cultures that have overlaps, right, but are their own thing. The United States is such a large area geographically that there is no American folk art as one big category as much as there's the folk art of Appalachia or the folk art of the Mississippi Delta or that sort of thing, right? So regional level, local level, family level, like the Meddar's family in North Georgia, in which ceramic pot making is passed down from generation to generation. That's the way that it really works. And those things don't blend so much like a melting pot, which you often hear, as much as they keep their distinct characteristics and they all just kind of go together to form their Americanness. So individual elements combine, but they remain distinct. Folk art is really a plural term rather than one homogeneous mass. It grows and it changes, but it retains its roots as it does so. And that is part of what makes it so interesting. We have so many different cultures within the United States uh, that can influence us in different ways. So those are kind of some of the main points, some of the main themes in folk art questions and quandaries. And I wanted to go over those so that you have kind of more of an understanding of some of the examples that the article brings up without you having to go do all the work for yourself. Hopefully that is helpful.